Hello and welcome to today's Mediaworks Masterclass. As you'll see on screen, today we're going to talk all things accessibility and UX. Again, just to put it out there from the off, we are going to be offering, and I'll repeat this at the end, we'll be offering a free accessibility and UX check as part of this masterclass. So please don't miss that opportunity, because we're going to talk about the importance of all things accessibility and UX check. So I really do hope as many of you do engage with and sign up to that. We are going to have a link in the chat that people can access, that people can sign up through. But again, we'll share that at the beginning and share that at the end. So I guess first and foremost, my name's David Norris. I'm the Group Operations Director here at Mediaworks, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's a bit different for us all here at Mediaworks in the sense that we have done things with partners in the past, but we're very fortunate to have one of our key partners with us today, which is Michael from Recite Me. So, Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you very much for having me. So my name is Michael Halban. I'm the Head of Global Marketing at Recite Me, and we are an accessibility software and service business helping organizations around the world make their websites accessible from a build perspective, and also how to create inclusive experiences for everyone's users. And yeah, I suppose our partnership perfectly aligns with your websites, your audiences, which we'll get onto, and how SEO, UX all plays a big part in accessibility.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks for obviously introducing Recite Me as well. And then Johnny.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Johnny, I'm the User Experience Director at Mediaworks. So my role sits in between our data and insights teams, our design teams, our development teams, to make sure that we're designing experiences that are best in class for our users, but also accessible, and making sure that we create those inclusive experiences.
Right, well, thanks very much, Johnny. I think going into this masterclass, I think what I would say is it's been amazing to see the interest in this topic, and I think it's really live and out there, and we'll talk about that as we go through. And we've got, over 400 people signed up for the masterclass alone, which shows sort of the interest in this space. But I guess the question that immediately comes to mind to start us off would be, why should marketing teams and website owners care about making their digital landscape accessible?
I think it's really important to think about the context of and breadth and scale of that audience, because I think the stat is it's over 60% of people immediately think an accessible audience is somebody with disability who needs care, when actually it's not. It affects everybody. Mm-hmm. And really, if you split that sort of 8 billion population and break it down, there's people who are self-identified as disabled, need assistive technology. There's people who are non-identified, who don't necessarily identify themselves as disabled, but may have something along the lines of dyslexia, who do need that support. There are people who are allies, who will be family, friends, people who want to create those better experiences for user groups who require that. And then there's everybody else, and really putting this sort of experience and wrapping accessibility and inclusivity around what we design, what we deliver, affect everybody and makes everybody's life a whole lot easier.
Yeah.
I think when we talk, just to kind of touch on as well a little bit more around that sort of audience that identifies and non-identifies, we can really break that down into sort of permanent, temporary, and situational as well. So if you put it into context of somebody having a permanent disability, maybe that they have lost an arm, maybe they are deaf, maybe they are sort of born with that sort of ailment, but then you can put that into a temporary situation where actually it's somebody with a broken arm who then can only use a device with one hand and can't sort of always have that accessible experience. And then you can break it down into situational, whereby somebody may be holding a baby a lot of the time, and actually, again, they've only got access to one hand to use devices. So really it's understanding that it's not just people with that permanent need that we're marketing to and creating experiences for. There's a whole breadth of audience in here that we need to consider.
Yeah, and I think as we go through, some of the statistics around this topic are really interesting. I think when we were obviously pulling this together, we looked at some really interesting statistics around volumes of people that actually do require support in terms of that assistive technology, and also from a marketing perspective, therefore, the opportunity that exists in terms of being able to serve audiences effectively.
Yeah.
And again, that leads me nicely on sort of who does need that online support.
Yeah. So follow on from Johnny, I think the penny drop moment of this conversation is more people than we actually think. People who have a disability, which, as I see on the screen there, 135 million people across Europe. Europe is a key topic of this conversation, as we'll get on to, but it goes from disabilities to visual impairments, people with learning difficulties, aging population, people who don't speak their native language in certain countries. These are all different types of people who need our support online, and we need to make sure we're building websites that are accessible and easy to use. So it's a much larger people than you think, for sure.
And I guess we talk about, don't we, like people who face barriers online, and you've touched upon a bit of that there, Michael.
I think, we very closely linked to UX and minimal clicks to outcome, if you like, is them barriers. How do we reduce the barriers for everyone? And when we look at the data that's out there against people with disabilities, it's scary about how many people do face. And then what happens, like we said there, 70% or 69% of people will leave a website. They're going to go away, go to one of your competitors and actually go and spend their money or invest in them services and not your good selves. So creating or reducing barriers is massive for businesses. A nice segue into the smart business supply side of that. I think what we say, we're attracting a wide audience. Making your website accessible, easier to use, is going to tap into an audience you may not have been privy to. And that audience comes with a spending power as well. Like Johnny mentioned there, not just the people with disabilities, but their families as well and their colleagues. And then that then boosts your brand reputation, the trust of your brand. Statistic out there that people are more likely to spend more at a company that they trust and have the reputation to because they're accessible. And these are all the things that website owners, marketing teams need to take into consideration.
Yeah, I think there was a key piece there that Michael touched on around that sort of building trust, and with that breakdown stat, it's between 70 and 80% of people with accessibility needs will return to the same website because they know the experience is accessible. And so therefore you are already sort of removing yourself from where they will spend their time online.
Yeah, and I think the thing we're talking here is a lot about online, but I think for us, what we do know from a Mediaworks perspective is it's not just about conversions online, is it? We're not talking just about pure e-commerce play here at all by any stretch. What we know is that the vast majority of people, I think it's something like a statistic that Google have, is like 91% of people Google before they actually then go and engage with a business, whether that be online or offline. And we know, therefore, that websites have a massive role to play in terms of that user journey, no matter whether you're selecting which gym to go to, which university to study at, or whether you are actually purchasing something online. There's got to be that balance, but we know that the website forms a massive part of the key touch points in that user journey. So I guess then we've covered off the why bit, the sort of the context. I guess, how should people approach website accessibility and inclusion?
Yeah, so here at Recite Me, we try and keep it as simple as possible because it can get complicated. So if we think about the accessibility compliance, the design and the development, how your website's built is very important, which will come to EA and WCAG laws, website accessibility content guidelines. And then you've got the experience, how someone uses your website. How do they do that? Through UX, through additional tools. And here at Recite, we look at accessibility in them two cohorts.
I think to sort of sit on the back of that as well, there's the two ways of looking at that from a compliance, from an inclusive experience piece. But I think there's a fundamental of understand who your audience are, like in not just understanding this is the type of persona we normally market to, so that's who we need to build an experience around. Actually understand the breadth of people that you could be affecting with delivering accessible solutions. So for me, there's a huge piece of this where actually you do the research up front to actually speak to your audience, understand the segmentation, understand their needs and their barriers we touched on before around actually are we stopping them from having that inclusive experience and therefore removing a whole segment of people we could be dealing with and could be sort of marketing to, creating experiences around.
Touching on that audience as well, part of the EA, the European Accessibility Act, which we'll get into, is around that feedback of your audience. So it's very much based around POUR, P-O-U-R, which is perceivable, operable, understandable and robust. I'm glad I got that right. And that's all around understanding what your audience and your users need. So yes, it's how your website's built, but it's getting that feedback from the audience to make sure exactly what they want.
Yeah, definitely the importance of continuous feedback loops, I think, is one, it's an important feature of creating a solid user experience anyway, and that continuous improvement, but also is a real feature into this to understand how we make sure that we're allowing everyone to have that inclusive experience. And we kind of touched on some of those key aspects here in terms of how we design, how we develop with accessibility in mind. And really there's a few different ways that we have to think about that. We kind of touched on robust, understandable, sort of perceivable, and making sure that that solution is navigatable. We want to make sure that somebody, you know, if they require the ability to tab through the navigation of a website, there's a few that I've had conversations with over the last week whereby the tab jumped straight to the call to action on page, and it's, in your mind you might want to drive someone there, but that isn't the experience of this website. That is driving a conversion and forcing somebody down that route. We need to give somebody the same experience through, whether it's tabbing through it, whether it's through screen readers or sort of anything like that. We need to give them the same experience as anybody else would receive in that.
Yeah, and I think this is a really interesting sort of diagram on screen as well, because I think that probably often when people do consider these areas in the past, they've probably just tabbed accessibility on as a step in the process, rather than being a central thing that actually links with every other area. So I think it's so important that you see that as a core driving principle rather than a component.
Yeah, definitely. I think these sort of pieces here is sort of some of our principles when we come to design and develop a site, and these are the aspects that we take into sort of co-designing a site. I mean, if I pick clients out, say the social housing sector, we will co-design a product aligned with audience to make sure that it meets their needs. We will factor in each of these sort of core pieces to make sure it ticks the boxes and all of these, but these principles will then follow us all the way through the QA process as well, to make sure that at every step accessibility is getting considered and thought about.
So you've touched upon it, Michael, so far, but I guess what is the European Accessibility Act and what does it mean for digital platforms?
So the European Accessibility Act, firstly, it is to harmonise accessibility standards across Europe. We've talked about making user experience a level playing field essentially across all websites, and rightly so this legislation has come into play to make sure that all organisations are doing that, creating a fair environment that everyone can then use products and services and purchase online. And the next part of the question is going to be who it affects. That's the number one question that all organisations are going to ask. It applies to countries in the EU, as you would expect, but also more importantly for us in the UK now, is if we sell products into the EU. So through obviously the information we've got on our website on the Act itself, actually 25% of the audience is from the US. So we can see that this Act is going worldwide because obviously large organisations do businesses in the EU.
Yeah.
And then when it comes down to, it's not always, usually an accessibility regulation is around public sector, the Public Bodies Act here in the UK. But this is one of the first with the ADA in the US that is driving private sectors to make sure their websites are accessible. And as you can see, over 10 employees are 2 million turnover.
And I think it's interesting because in the US, they do have the ADA, which he's kind of just mentioned there, whereby there is forced penalties that sit behind not being compliant with this sort of thing. So it becomes a reality for organizations that actually you have to comply with this. And absolutely, we're talking about the sort of EA there around its compliance within the EU, but actually this is much wider than that. It's it's about businesses trading into the EU, but that is going to span out as well, and it will start to cover businesses who just operate within the UK.
Yeah. I've been in the space now over 6 years. It's been apparent where accessibility, it should be the right thing to do. Morally, you should be helping people online. Then it's the smart thing to do because it's business and people think, oh, we can we can increase business here.
Yep.
But now it's the thing you must do.
Yeah.
With the legislations now coming into play, it's something that most organisations that we're talking with need to be addressing and put as a core principle.
And you talked briefly there just about the private and public sector split. So what you were saying obviously is this impacts both areas.
Correct, it does, yes. This impacts both areas, but it's something that public sector should have been doing for a few years now, to be honest. So I'm sure people on the call who work in the public sector understand what we're talking about and what steps need to be put in place. This is just another layer that needs to be considered when designing and delivering websites. And the key dates for this, there's 2 for the EA. So from the 20th of June, when the Act comes in play, all new content and service online must be fully compliant.
Right.
So that's quite a big thing. Got to think about our processes of, just from a marketing team perspective, of having to put new content out, especially if you've got big SEO strategies and things.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work there. And then we all probably don't realize how big our websites actually are. So we've got to 2030 to look at our legacy data and our content, but it's a lot of work to be done there to make our websites fully compliant.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider, isn't there, between obviously now and that immediate deadline, but then it's also then the countdown really starts ticking on your legacy activities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I guess what are the risks of non-compliance? Like, I don't want, we've talked a bit about the carrot, this is a bit of the stick, so it's like, what are the risks of non-compliance?
Yeah, so like the AD that you mentioned, Jody, it is legal penalties. There's, if you look at famous sort of domino lawsuits over in the US, that will be the case for the European Accessibility Act. But secondly, your brand reputation. We mentioned about audience, we mentioned about trust, returning customers, new audiences. That brand reputation and trust will get damaged. If people don't have a good experience and we head online and see that, that's going to be more damning than the legal penalties, I could imagine, if they're not an effective revenue loss.
Yeah, massively.
It's almost thinking about that trust piece. It's thinking about that in the sense that if anybody goes online now and you go between a website that is well designed and one that is sort of hashed together, you kind of always lean towards that well designed. Well, this will be that sort of new normal of, well, actually, you'll start leaning towards the more accessible experience because you know that that's up to date, meets guidelines, and is kind of more as an all-round stronger experience than one that isn't set up in that fact.
It'll just be naturally easier to use.
Yes.
And I think from a marketing perspective, Johnny, I think we've been out to see clients together this week, and we've talked to them about sort of how competitive the markets are right now in terms of people being online. And I think we do talk about those trust metrics and like trust indications and trust indicators on websites, etc. This for me is going to form a massive part of that, because when there is such choice, it's sort of the guidelines and the parameters and the criteria for selection are going to be so much more stringent. And if you don't hit the benchmarks, ultimately you are going to be penalised from an audience perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And that's where that kind of span at the start looks at when, in terms of who that affects and whether it's somebody who identifies, non-identifies, allies and other audience, especially around that allies and other audience. The initial audiences will be focused more around that accessible experience. But allies and sort of non-identified audiences will gear more towards that in the future, because they'll start to see that difference between sites that are actually pushing for this and trying to do their best to create accessible experiences versus ones that are kind of leaving that behind, and it's almost still becomes that bolt on to creating a web experience that some people have now.
So I guess then we've talked about all of the compliance elements, but what are the tangible business benefits of having an accessible website? I think we've touched on some of this as we've gone through, Johnny.
Yeah, I think for me, one of those sort of key points is, and I know we've got a few points on screen there, but one of the key ones is, if I'm to think about this purely from like a conversion driven point, is that purple pound. And actually there is such a huge marketplace there, and there was some stats at the start around the scale of that market. Actually, like, if you're not dealing and creating that accessible experience, you are completely bypassing a segment of this market. And that's, I mean, looking more around the e-commerce experience, but you are completely bypassing a whole audience here. And you touched on whether that's universities or whether it's the gym you're selecting. Well, actually, again, a whole audience that you are just ignoring there.
Yeah.
And actually, if there's an industry that is largely ignoring that audience, be that pioneer, be the one to step up and say, actually, I'm going to create the most accessible experience and become the one that is known in your industry as the leader in this.
Yeah, and I think then that leads us into sort of that SEO and organic traffic element. I mean, we've just got off the back of doing a four rounds of SEO masterclasses, and a part of that really is the technical element. So in terms of indexation and crawlability, being like, from a Google perspective, in terms of having pages that are technically compliant. But you touched on it there, Michael, around content as well, and the role that content plays in a lot of this, and the experience that you get. And what I would say is Google is, and is quite clear on the fact that accessibility is part of their ranking factors in terms of, and again, thinking about where it's pulling sources from and where it's getting information from to feed the algorithm. It's like, if you have got a website and it doesn't meet these standards, you will be penalised, and ultimately it will impact on rankings.
Yeah.
And I guess then finally, Johnny, just around that reputation and trust piece.
Yeah, I think you touched on it a little bit before around sort of that. We've had those conversations this week around actually trust metrics and looking at adding reviews on site, testimonials, things like that. But this is going to become such a huge trust metric as an organisation or a business who is wanting to create that solid, accessible, inclusive experience for someone will become a trust metric in its own right.
Yeah.
And it just shows that you are taking those steps forward to deliver that inclusive experience for everyone, not just focusing solely on conversion.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting. I really liked your point, actually, Michael, around like the right thing to do morally, sort of the smart thing to do from a business perspective, but now it's like you must do it. You know, it's like a compliant piece. So I guess part of this is, and part of the reason we partner with Recite Me is really looking at how you can help improve that digital accessibility. So what's the processes that you go through in terms of some of the tools that you've got, Michael, there at Recite Me? It'd be really interesting to learn a bit more about them.
Yeah, of course. We'll keep it super simple, really. So their inclusive experience, we talk about how someone uses your website. So not everyone who needs assistive technology has their own assistive technology, screen readers, for example. So we provide an assistive toolbar that provides a suite of accessibility tools that comes from the top of your website, and a user is able to customize their experience. For instance, our founder, Ross Linnett, who's dyslexic, and myself also, we like a yellow background with black text, and we would use a ruler. And that would be able to much easier for us to engage with that content. Yeah. So that's how that toolbar uses. And last year we had 7.1 million toolbar launches. And then also a huge part is our translation function, over 150 languages. So trying to create an environment that hopefully everyone can use that said website with.
It's interesting that, because again, we talk about the global aspect of websites right now. I mean, we were saying the other day, again, with a partner who's working across Europe, it's like, at Mediaworks, I think we work across, I think it's something like 80 different countries and 35 different languages. We've got campaigns running in like right now. So it is such an important element, because again, it's not that everyone in France speaks French, and everyone in Germany speaks German. And I think sometimes we lose a lot of that nuance. And I think that having some of those tools and some of those systems in place is really important.
Hugely. I think it goes back to audience, doesn't it? It's making sure that we'll be able to provide a suite of tools that can help as many people as possible to use your website. It's simple as that.
And when we say things like reading aids and style options, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So reading aids would be magnifying glass, ruler, screen mask. We also have some tools where we got page simplifier, so you hit the icon itself, it'll then go through the text, and then it'll rewrite the text in such a more simplified version. So for speed readers or people that want to, so I think reading ages as well. Yeah. So reading ages, it's the average reading age should be 9, but a lot of more complex websites, it's much more than that. Right. This tool helps bring that reading age right down, so it's easier to engage and people can understand. And style options, fonts, colours, as we mentioned, a lot of different disabilities. People with disabilities like different colour combinations. So our tools are able to support people in viewing content as easily as possible.
I think it's worth touching on with this in terms of that assistive toolbar. If you were to attempt to build all of this natively within your website, you can only imagine the amount of work that would have to go into delivering some of this.
Yeah.
So the fact that this toolbar exists, which is why I'm a big advocate of this within sort of all experiences and everything that we kind of talk about with our clients, is like, it delivers so much in such a quick turnaround time. It's half an hour setup in terms of development space just to put that script on site, and it is as simple as that.
Yeah.
And it can bring you into a much wider audience and allow people that much more inclusive experience almost instantly.
Yeah, and that step changed from trying to build it in-house to sort of very quickly being best in class and compliant and hitting all of the reasons that we've mentioned is like a super selling point, and something that, again, people should be considering.
I'm conscious of time, so so we also have an accessibility checker, one of our other softwares, and what this essentially does is 4 stages to it, trying to keep it super simple. We scope your website, we identify your digital landscape, images, text, pages, PDFs. We then scan it, identify issues against WCAG, which is lines with compliance of EEA, and then we use a set of tools to help you fix these issues as easily and quickly as possible. So you've got developer views, you've got marketing team views, a bit of AI support in there, and essentially making sure you can make your website as accessible as possible from a build perspective with as little friction, because it can be really complicated. Yeah. So our tools there to really help narrow down that. And then talking about creating content from the 28th of June forward, that we got then that remediation and maintenance side of it, making sure your website and what you're creating is accessible, and we've got alerts and a maintenance tool that's built in there as well. So a nice platform to make sure your content and website's always accessible.
Brilliant. So I guess finally, in the last couple of minutes, I think we'd like to finish by just saying, what can any team do today to improve accessibility? Like a key takeaway in terms of actions, things that people could really lead on to start really implementing some of this today.
I think this is where we both sort of aligned, don't we?
Yeah, we aligned perfectly.
Mediaworks and Recite, because SEO website performance is perfectly aligned with accessibility. So alt text, everyone that can get into their website is able to add alt text to an image. So that an alt text is if it's a screen reader or someone can't see an image and they tab onto it, the screen reader will read aloud the description of that image. And obviously from an SEO perspective, that's massive part of it. Color contrast, working in marketing and websites, we all love nice fancy websites, text over the top of images, crikey. But the contrast has to hit a minimum threshold to be compliant. But once again, then people are able to read stuff on your website. Better, easiest user experience. You touched on this, Johnny. Tabbing, not going down to the call to action. We need to make sure someone can navigate for our website for what they want to do, not what we want them to do. So making sure your page structure from your H1s, your 2s, your P tags are all in place. So them 3 things there, any marketing team or content team should be able to go and do that straight away.
Absolutely. And then I think finally, Johnny, when we talk about reviewing the data, to understand sort of where you can optimize the experience.
Yeah, definitely. It wouldn't be me if I didn't come talking about the data that we can access. But I think for me, it's like, there's a lot we can implement initially, put it in place, but it's also understanding what someone's experience is going through the site. And actually, you own a lot of data already, whether that's in Analytics or Matomo or Hotjar or Microsoft Clarity. There's a lot of data in there that already tells us how somebody is moving through, and we can almost identify the friction points straight away in those spaces as well, so we can legitimately see where someone is struggling with our experience. So one, we can implement the technical changes that will allow our platform to be better, but actually understanding where somebody is coming, where they're dropping off, where there's a barrier, where there's a blocker, gives us such a huge insight on the frustration that somebody must be feeling as they're trying to navigate our platform.
Right, well, thank you very much. I think that's been like a really enlightening, really interesting session. I think I'd just like to finish, obviously, 2 quick points really by saying, we are offering these free accessibility and UX checks. We've talked about how accessibility and UX are intertwined. And again, some of those check-in tools, etc., that you've mentioned there, Michael, really do sort of lead into what we'll be presenting as part of those checks and audits. So honestly, if anybody does want to learn more about this and utilize some of those tools and get an initial view on how your website's performing from an accessibility and UX perspective and wants to open that conversation, then do hit the link that's available in the chat right now. We'll also be sending this out on email afterwards, so people who are watching on catch-up can also engage with this content. And that's something we'll be focusing on across Mediaworks for the next couple of weeks. And then finally, I'd just like to be saying we have got another masterclass next week with another large partner of ours, LinkedIn, where we're going to be talking all things unlocking hidden B2B buys and driving marketing and sales performance. But finally, I think it's just for me to say thank you very much for your input today. Thank you very much for Recite Me. And obviously, thank you very much for Johnny, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.